everybody. So lovely to see you all again, even if it is virtually. I hope you've all enjoyed having a go at some of those experiments. I know I really love putting them together. So today, it's been lovely to get some of that lovely feedback from a lot of you about the BFG. It is a beautiful book, and I know a lot of you have probably read it before, but it's quite nice to reread a book and quite nice to reread it with someone. So it just helps us get our fluency and get us reading beautifully like I know we all can. So I know somebody already told me that the next chapter is The Cave. So here we go. The giant ran on and on, but now a curious change took place in his way of running. He seemed suddenly to go into a higher gear. Faster and faster he went, and soon he was travelling at such a speed that the landscape became blurred. The wind stung Sophie's cheeks, and it made her eyes water. It whipped her head back and whistled in her ears. She could no longer feel the giant's feet touching the ground. She had a weird sensation that they were actually flying. It was impossible to tell whether they were over land or sea. This giant had some sort of magic in his legs. The wind rushing against Sophie's face became so strong that she had to duck down again into the blanket to prevent her head from being blown away. Was it really possible that they were crossing oceans? It certainly felt that way to Sophie. She crouched in the blanket and listened to the howling of the wind. It went on for what seemed like hours. Then, all at once, the wind stopped its howling. The pace began to slow down. Sophie could feel the giant's feet pounding once again over the earth. She poked her head up out of the blanket to have a look. They were in a country of thick forests and rushing rivers. The giant had definitely slowed down and was now running more normally, although normal was a silly word to use to describe a galloping giant. He leapt over a dozen rivers. He went rattling through a great forest, then down into a valley and up over a range of hills as bare as concrete. And soon he was galloping over a desolate wasteland that was not quite of this earth. The ground was flat and pale yellow. Great lumps of blue rock were scattered around, and dead trees stood everywhere like skeletons. The moon had long since disappeared, and now the dawn was breaking. Sophie, still peering out from the blanket, saw suddenly ahead of her a great craggy mountain. The mountain was dark blue, and all around it the sky was gushing and glistening with light. Bits of pale gold were flying among delicate, frosty white flakes of cloud, and over to one side the rim of the morning sun was coming up red as blood. Right beneath the mountain the giant stopped. He was puffing mightily. His great chest was heaving in and out, and he paused to catch his breath. Directly in front of them, lying against the side of the mountain, Sophie could see a massive round stone. It was as big as a house. The giant reached out and rolled the stone to one side as easily as if it had been a footwall. And now, where the stone had been, there appeared a vast black hole. The hole was so large the giant didn't even have to duck his head in as he went in. He strode into the black hole, still carrying Sophie in one hand, the trumpet and the suitcase in the other. As soon as he was inside, he stopped and turned and rolled the great stone back into place so that the entrance to his secret cave was completely hidden from the outside. Now that the entrance had been sealed up, there was not a glint of light inside the cave. All was black. Sophie felt herself being lowered to the ground. Then the giant let go of the blanket completely. His footsteps moved away, and Sophie sat there in the dark, shivering with fear. "He is getting ready to eat me," she told herself. "He will probably eat me raw, just like I am. Or perhaps he'll boil me first, or maybe he'll fry me. He will drop me like a rasher of bacon into some gigantic frying pan sizzling with fat." A blaze of light suddenly lit up the whole place. Sophie blinked and stared. she saw an enormous cavern with a high rocky roof. The walls on either side were lined with shelves, and on the shelves there stood row upon row of glass jars. There were jars everywhere. They were piled up in the corners. They filled every nook and cranny of the cave. In the middle of the floor there was a table 12 feet high and a chair to match. The giant took off his black cloak and hung it against the wall. Sophie saw that under the cloak he was wearing a sort of collarless shirt and a dirty old leather waistcoat that didn't seem to have any buttons. His trousers were faded green and were far too short in the legs, and on his bare feet he was wearing a pair of ridiculous sandals that for some reason had holes cut out along each side with a large hole at the end where his toes stuck out. Sophie, crouching on the floor of the cave in her nightie, gazed back at him through thick steel-rimmed glasses. She was trembling like a leaf in the wind, and a finger of ice was running up and down the length of her spine. "Ha ha ha ha!" shouted the giant, walking forward and rubbing his hands together. "What has us got here?" His booming voice rolled around the walls of the cave like a burst of thunder. The giant picked up the trembling Sophie with one hand and carried her across the cave and put her on the table. "Now he really is going to eat me," Sophie thought. The giant sat down and stared hard at Sophie. He had truly enormous ears. Each one was as big as the wheel of a truck, and he seemed to be able to move them inwards and outwards from his head as he wished. "I is hungry," the giant boomed. He grinned, showing massive square teeth. The teeth were very white and very square, and they sat in his mouth like huge slices of white bread. Papa, please don't eat me," Sophie stammered. The giant let out a bellow of laughter. "Just because I is a giant, you think I is a man-gobbling cannibal?" he shouted. "You is about right. Giants is all cannibal and murderful, and they does gobble up human beings. We is in giant country now. Giants is everywhere around. Out there, us has the famous bone-crunching giant. Bone-crunching giant crunches up 2 whoopsie-whiffling human beings for supper every night. Noise is ear-bursting. Noise of crunching bones goes crickety-crack for miles." "Oh, ouch," Sophie said. "Bone-crunching giant only gobbles human beings from Turkey," the giant said. "Every night, Bone Cruncher is galloping off to Turkey to gobble Turks." Sophie's sense of patriotism was suddenly so bruised by this remark that she became quite angry. "Why Turks?" she blurted out. "What's wrong with the English?" Bone-crunching giant says Turks is tasting ever so much juicier and more scrumdiddlyumptious. Bone Crusher says Turkish human beings has a glamoury flavour. He says Turks from Turkey is tasting of turkey. "Oh, well, I suppose they would," Sophie said. "Oh, of course they would. Every human being is diddly and different. Some is scrumdiddlyumptious and some uckily luscious. Greeks is a full of ucky luscious. No giant is eating Greeks ever." "Why not?" Sophie asked. "Greeks from Greece is all tasting greasy," the giant said. "Oh, I imagine that's possible too." Sophie said she was wondering with a bit of tremble what all this was talking about eating people was leading up to. Whatever happened, she simply must play along with his peculiar giant and smile at his jokes. But were they jokes? Perhaps the great brute was just working up an appetite by talking about food. "As I am saying, all human beings is having different flavours. Human beings from Panama is tasting very strong of hats." "Why hats?" Sophie asked. "You is not very clever, is you? I thought all human beings is full of brains, but your head is emptier than a bungandole." Can I ask, do you like vegetables?" Sophie asked, hoping to steer the conversation towards a slightly less dangerous kind of food. You is trying to change the subject. We is having an interesting babblement about the taste of human bean. The human bean is not a vegetable. Ah, but the bean is a vegetable, Sophie said. Not the human bean. The human bean has 2 legs and a vegetable has no legs at all. Sophie didn't argue anymore. The last thing she wanted to do was to make the giant cross. The human bean is coming in billions of different flavours. For instance, human beans from Wales is tasting very whooshery of fish. There is something very fishy about Wales. You mean Wales? Wales is something quite different. Whales are in the ocean and Wales is a country, Sophie said. Oh, Wales is Wales. Don't gobble funk around with words. I will now give you another example. Human beings from Jersey has a most disgustable wool tickle on the tongue. Human beings from Jersey is tasting of cardigans. No, you mean jerseys, Sophie said. You are once again gobble funking. Don't do it. This is serious and snitching subjects. May I continue? Please do, Sophie said. Danes from Denmark is tasting ever so much of dogs. Oh, of course. They are the taste of Great Danes. Wrong! Danes from Denmark is tasting doggy because they is tasting of Labradors. Oh, well then, what do peoples of Labrador taste of? Sophie asked. Danes! Great Danes! I think you're getting a bit mixed up, Sophie said. It is a very mixed up giant, but I does do my best, and I is not nearly as mixed up as the other giants. I know one who gallops all the way to Wellington for his supper. Wellington? Where is Wellington? Your head is full of squashed flies. Wellington is in New Zealand. The human beings in Wellington has an especially scrumdiddly-umptious taste. So says the welly-eating giant. Oh, well, what do the people of Wellington taste of? Sophie asked. Boots, the giant said. Oh, of course, I should have known that. Sophie decided that this conversation had now gone on long enough. If she was going to be eaten, she'd rather get it over and done with right away than be hanging around any more. What sort of human beings do you eat? She asked, trembling. Me? Shouted the giant, his mighty voice making the glass jars rattle on the shelves. Me gobbling up human beings? This I never. The others, yes, and all the others is gobbling them up every night, but not me. I is a freaky giant. I is a nice and jumbly giant. I is the only nice and jumbly giant in giant country. I is the big, friendly giant. I is the BFG. What is your name? My name is Sophie, Sophie said, hardly daring to believe the good news she had just heard. I do love the BFG. He's such a big softy at heart. All right, my lovely people, I hope you've had a good day. The sun's starting to come out, well, at least it's trying to. So I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow with a bit of excitement along the way, as always on a Friday. So take care, gorgeous people, and sleep tight.